What if the calendar that orders your life, marking your days, your seasons, your years, was never the calendar the Creator intended? What if the rhythm you follow was not given from heaven, but carved and recarved by human hands for purposes that had nothing to do with truth, covenant, or the appointed times of God? Picture a slab of ancient stone, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Upon it, a number is engraved, 364. It is not random. It is the count of days woven into the very fabric of creation, the heartbeat of a divine design. And then, imagine a hand, powerful, deliberate, pressing against that number, scraping it away, replacing it with 365, shifting the months, bending the seasons, tilting the balance of time itself. One stroke of the chisel, and the harmony between heaven and earth begins to warp. You have been told that the passing of a year is measured by the Earth's journey around the sun, that this is the natural way, that nothing else could be true. But what if this truth is the first and most successful deception? What if the original calendar was not lost to ignorance, but buried under the rubble of conquest, priestly politics, and imperial convenience for the people of ancient Israel? Time was not a neutral thing. It was sacred space. It was as much a creation of God as light or water or breath. Days, weeks, months, and years were not just numbers, they were appointments, alignments, signals of when heaven would meet earth. Festivals and Sabbaths were not human traditions, they were doors in time, opened only at precise moments known to the Creator. But somewhere along the line, the doors were moved, the locks were changed. The appointed times were broken and reassembled into a different shape, close enough to feel familiar, but far enough to pull generations out of sync with the pulse of eternity. And the most unsettling part is this: almost no one remembers it happened. So I must ask you again, with the weight of this hidden history pressing in, if the calendar you trust is not God's calendar, then whose is it? And if it was changed once, what would stop it from being changed again, long before the towers of empires rose and fell, before the hands of kings and scholars argued over months and days? There was a moment when time itself was handed down from heaven. It happened on a mountain that burned with unearthly fire, its summit wrapped in a cloud no storm could create. Moses climbed that mountain not only to receive the law carved in stone, but to hear the rhythm of creation from the mouth of a messenger who stood in the very presence of God. The Book of Jubilees calls him the angel of the presence, a voice not speaking on his own, but carrying the pulse of the Creator's design. And in that high place, far from the sound of human cities, the angel unfolded the pattern, a year of 364 days, measured not by the compromises of astronomy as men would later define it, but by a perfect weave of weeks, months, and seasons. In this design, every year was a completed circle, 52 exact weeks, each beginning and ending in harmony with the next. The festivals did not drift. They returned precisely, year after year, to their appointed day. The Sabbath was not simply the seventh day in an endless line of sevens. It was a pillar in a structure so precise that heaven and earth seemed to breathe together. This was more than a calendar. It was a covenant. Each feast, each rest, Each Jubilee was a reminder that time belonged to God, not to kings or astronomers or high priests. To live by it was to align one's very heartbeat with the heartbeat of creation. But the angel's words also carried a warning. There would come a time when men would abandon this design. They would add days where none were meant to be, shift months out of their season, and the appointed times would slip from their anchors. The harmony would break. The song of sacred time would be drowned out by a different rhythm, a rhythm not set by the Creator's hand. Moses descended the mountain, carrying more than the tablets of stone. He carried the breath of sacred time itself, entrusted to a people who would one day forget. And once forgotten, the path back would be harder to find than any lost city. For the map was not carved in the earth, but in the turning of the heavens. If you gather the fragments of Israel's oldest testimonies and hold them side by side, a pattern emerges with startling clarity. The Book of Jubilees speaks of it as though it were as fixed as the laws of gravity. The Book of Enoch records it in visions, mapping the courses of the sun and moon to a perfection no mortal mathematician could improve. Even the Torah, in its ancient Hebrew phrasing, assumes a cycle that fits only within a year of 364 days. These texts were not written in ignorance of the skies. They knew the phases of the moon, the tilt of the earth, the play of light and shadow on the equinoxes. Yet they chose deliberately, insistently, to measure time by a system that kept the feasts locked to their true season, that aligned the opening of harvest with the opening of heaven's appointed doors. In Jubilees, the angel warns Moses that if this calendar is abandoned, the feasts will be off their order, and they will disturb all the seasons. It is not a casual caution, it is a prophecy of loss. The sacred markers, meant to be as unchanging as the constellations, would slip like stones from a wall. What was once an eternal frame would dissolve into human improvisation. But that is precisely what happened. Somewhere between the days of the prophets and the rise of foreign rule, the foundation began to shift. The memory of the 364-day design was not openly debated and rejected. It was allowed to fade, like an heirloom placed in the back of a chest. It was not destroyed, it was neglected until no one could quite remember its shape or value. And here lies the danger when a truth is erased from the collective memory. It can be replaced without resistance. A different number of days, a different arrangement of months, and with it, a different rhythm of worship, one that no longer matches the heartbeat of the one who first set the lights in the sky. The unity once visible across Jubilees, Enoch, and the Torah now lies scattered, like shards of a shattered tablet. To piece them together is to rediscover a design the world has long been trained to forget. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee the gap it leaves in everything we think we know about sacred time. The change did not come with a trumpet blast or a royal decree carved in stone for all to see. It began in the shadows, small adjustments, quiet accommodations, the kind that slip past notice until the original shape is gone. The earliest clues are scattered through the records like faint fingerprints left on ancient clay. Within the history of Israel, subtle anomalies began to appear. Feasts that had once been tethered to precise moments in the solar cycle began to drift. What had always aligned with the turn of a season now fell days, sometimes weeks, out of place. Farmers, once confident that their planting and harvesting matched the rhythm of the appointed times, began to rely on observation of the moon rather than the unbroken count of days. It was a practical change. They might have thought, yet practicality has always been the patient servant of compromise. In the writings of the prophets, there are flashes of frustration from the mouth of God himself. Through Amos, he rebukes those who observe the new moons while neglecting his justice, a sign that ritual timing had begun to bend under human preferences. The calendar, once an unshakable covenantal framework, was becoming a tool shaped by the hands of those who led the people. Beyond Israel's borders, powerful empires had their own designs. The Babylonians carried with them a lunisolar calendar, a system that required adjustments, intercalations, and priestly management. When they conquered, they did not simply take territory, they imposed order, and with it, their own measure of time. The danger was not merely that days were being counted differently. It was that the sacred anchor points the Sabbaths. The appointed feasts were being cut loose from the moorings set by the Creator. Once they drifted, the people no longer stood where heaven and earth met in their fullness. The rhythm of worship and life was no longer in step with the rhythm of creation. The shift was underway, quiet enough to avoid alarm, but deliberate enough to rewrite the people's relationship with time. And in the decades and centuries to come, the hand that made those first small adjustments would press harder, reshaping the very flow of the year until the original was nearly unrecognizable. If the change of a calendar can be done in secret, its permanence depends on language. Alter the words that describe time, and you alter how generations after you will understand it. This is where the deepest concealment took root, not only in the numbers themselves, but in the vocabulary that defined them. In the oldest Hebrew texts, the terms for day, week, month, and year carry layers of meaning that modern tongues flatten into single syllables. The Hebrew shana for year is not merely a numerical count, it implies a completed cycle, a perfect return. The word mode for appointed time is not simply a date, it is a divinely fixed appointment, one that cannot be moved without breaking the covenant it represents. When these words passed through translation first into Greek, then into Latin, and finally into the vernacular of every nation, the precision of their meaning began to erode. The Septuagint, translating for a Hellenistic world accustomed to lunar reckoning, bent the language toward what their audience already knew. Latin scribes, inheriting the Roman solar calendar, chose terms that fit their own civil system rather than the exactness of the Hebrew design. Even subtle changes in word order mattered. Where the original might have tied a feast to the 14th day of the first month in its appointed season, later renderings could make it sound like a movable observance dependent on other calculations. In this way, the original 364-day framework remained hidden in plain sight, its structure preserved in ancient manuscripts, but its instructions dulled in the tongues most people could read. This was not the work of a single hand in a single moment, but of centuries of copying, translating, and adapting, each step a tiny shift away from the original alignment. Over time, the very words that had once been keys to the Creator's calendar became a cipher, legible only to those who would go back to the source and learn the language of the ancients. And here is the irony: the 364-day year has never vanished from the pages of Scripture. It waits, encoded in the original words, for those willing to strip away the layers of linguistic dust. But as long as the words remain mistranslated, the calendar remains invisible, hidden not by absence, but by the comfort of familiar yet altered terms. For most of us, the measurement of time is a settled matter. We trust the clock on the wall, the calendar in our hands, the dates printed in books and newspapers. We believe these are neutral tools, accurate, universal, unquestionable. The collision comes when the ancient design of 364 days is laid beside the system we live by now. The two do not align, and the gap between them is more than a matter of arithmetic. It is a fracture in worldview. The modern year, whether Julian or Gregorian, floats on a rhythm that drifts through the seasons. Festivals move, eclipses shift, equinoxes slip by degrees. To most, this is acceptable, even necessary, to keep pace with astronomical reality. But in the ancient divine design, there was no drift. Every Sabbath fell exactly where it should. Every festival returned on the same day of the same week. Every year completed its perfect symmetry without human adjustment. When we are confronted with this difference, two beliefs collide. One says, we measure time according to nature, and this is truth. The other says, time is not ours to measure, it is God's to give, and only His appointed pattern is truth. The clash is not between science and superstition, but between two masters, one in the heavens, one in the hands of men. This is why the change in calendars is not a harmless historical curiosity. If the modern system is not in sync with the Creator's, then every appointed time we keep, whether Passover, Pentecost, or Sabbath, is potentially out of step with heaven's clock. And if worship is tied to appointment, then worship itself may be occurring at the wrong time. In that light, the shift from 364 to 365 days is not just a numerical tweak. It is a realignment of loyalty. It asks us, often without our knowing, to mark our lives by a pattern foreign to the one God revealed. To accept it without question is to give away the very framework that was meant to hold our covenant in place. This is the uncomfortable truth the ancients would have recognized instantly, but which modern minds resist. Not all calendars are equal. One is the work of the Creator, the other the construct of kingdoms. And you cannot live by both without compromising one. The question has hovered since the first crack appeared in the ancient design: who would dare to alter the calendar of the Creator? The answer is not a single name, nor a single empire, but a sequence of hands, each with its own motives, each leaving fingerprints on the structure of sacred time. The first culprits may have worn the robes of priesthood, not the crowns of kings. In certain periods of Israel's history, the priestly class held the power to declare when months began, when feasts would be observed, when the year would turn. If the sacred calendar was a lock, they held the keys. And like any power left unchecked, it was vulnerable to ambition. A priest who could shift a feast by a few days could control not only worship, but trade, harvest, and the pulse of the people's labor. Then came the empires. Babylon was the first great shadow to fall across the covenantal calendar. They brought with them a lunisolar system that required constant priestly adjustment, intercalating months, manipulating days to keep festivals in season. For a people in exile, adopting this foreign rhythm was not merely convenience, it was survival. Yet, with each year, they bent to it. The memory of the 364-day pattern dimmed. Centuries later, Rome would finish what Babylon began. The Julian calendar, imposed across the empire, was an instrument of unity and control. It made the empire predictable, synchronized, efficient, but in doing so, it pressed every conquered people into the same mold, flattening their sacred rhythms beneath the weight of imperial order. And when Rome's political calendar was baptized into church life, the divide between the Creator's time and man's time became an institution. The final stroke came with the Gregorian reform of the 16th century. Cloaked in the language of astronomical precision, it adjusted the Julian year to better match the solar cycle. But to those already long severed from the original 364-day design, it was simply another step down a path they no longer recognized. The reformers claimed to fix time. In truth, they fixed in place a system that had been broken for over 2 millennia. This is the bitter truth. The change was not a single betrayal, but a slow conquest. Priests, kings, and emperors each had their reasons: political cohesion, economic advantage, religious uniformity. None of them were the reasons given to Moses on Sinai. And while they were busy rewriting the year, the people learned to live inside a cage without seeing the bars. History remembers the names of those who ruled empires. Heaven remembers the names of those who moved the boundaries of sacred time. And somewhere between the two, we must decide whose record we believe. There was a moment, a hinge in history, when the shift from God's calendar to man's calendar stopped being an undercurrent and became official policy. The records do not frame it as treachery, they frame it as progress. But beneath the careful language of reform lay the quiet burial of the Creator's design. It happened in a season of consolidation. An empire can only hold its shape if its provinces move in lockstep, and the surest way to bind far-flung peoples is to bind their time across marketplaces, military garrisons, and temples. The same dates had to be kept, the same festivals observed, the same beginning to each year declared by the same authority. Time was no longer a gift from heaven, it was a decree from the capital. The decision did not come from a single meeting. It was forged in councils where priests and governors sat side by side, each weighing what could be gained by aligning the sacred with the imperial. A calendar controlled by the state was a calendar that could move armies, dictate harvest schedules, and draw tax revenues with mathematical precision. Religious observances were folded neatly into the civil year, their alignment with the Creator's appointed times quietly sacrificed to political harmony. The people adapted because they had no choice. The merchants welcomed a predictable cycle for trade. Soldiers followed orders without considering the stars or the seasons. Farmers were told when to plant and reap, whether or not the land was ready. The old way, the way that began with the voice of the angel of the presence, was dismissed as impractical, an artifact of a less enlightened age. There is an image that comes to mind: a great clock tower rising over a conquered city, its chimes drowning out the smaller bells of the local shrines. It is not that the smaller bells were forbidden, they were simply unheard beneath the new, dominant rhythm. And as each generation grew up under the sound of the empire's clock, fewer remembered the music of the old one. This was the turning point. Before this, the sacred calendar had been contested, bent, and pressured but still living in some form among the faithful. After this, it was overwritten in the public consciousness. The 364-day year was no longer merely ignored. It was replaced, enshrined in law, and enforced by the same machinery that policed the empire's borders. From that moment forward, time itself became a political instrument. And for the first time in history, the pulse of the empire and the pulse of its religion beat in perfect unison, not because heaven had decreed it, but because the empire had demanded it. When the calendar changed, the consequences were not confined to civic life or the orderly administration of an empire. The deeper wound was theological, for sacred time is not a neutral backdrop to worship. It is the framework within which worship becomes acceptable. In the Torah, the appointed times were not suggestions, they were divine invitations, each marked by a date chosen by the Creator himself. To shift that date was not merely to reschedule an event, it was to arrive at the wrong door, on the wrong day, before the presence of the King. The ancient festivals, Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles, were all anchored in the Creator's 364-day cycle. They were synchronized with the harvests, the movements of light, and the covenantal anniversaries that stretched back to the dawn of creation. In that design, every year was a mirror of the year before, a tapestry woven so tightly that no feast could drift without the whole pattern unraveling. But once the calendar was altered, that symmetry fractured. Passover might arrive days late, falling out of season. The Feast of Weeks might no longer align with the true count from the first fruits. The Day of Atonement could be observed when the heavenly court had already moved past its appointed session. On earth, the rituals were still performed. In heaven, the appointments were missed. The prophets hinted at this danger. In Isaiah's lament, God rejects the festivals of a people whose hearts and timing have strayed. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. The language is severe, because the breach is severe. A feast at the wrong time is not merely empty, it is offensive. A counterfeit offering placed before the throne. Beyond the loss of alignment came a subtler distortion. When the rhythm of worship no longer matched the Creator's design, the theology that rested on that rhythm began to bend. The meaning of the festivals shifted. The connection between earthly seasons and heavenly promises weakened. The people could no longer look at the turning of the year and see the Creator's story unfolding with mathematical precision. The narrative of redemption, embedded in the cycle of days, became obscured over centuries. This break in sacred time became invisible to those who inherited it. The faithful kept their feasts and Sabbaths according to the only calendar they knew, never realizing they were walking slightly out of step with the original covenantal beat. The tragedy is not that they stopped worshipping, but that they were worshipping on a rhythm that heaven no longer shared. And so the greatest theological consequence is this: the change of the calendar was not simply a historical event, it was a redefinition of the relationship between God and his people. To alter time is to alter covenant, and to alter covenant is to alter the very nature of faith itself. By the time the medieval centuries gave way to the age of discovery, the change was complete. The 364-day year was no longer debated in the public square or defended in the synagogue. It had faded into a kind of historical amnesia. replaced so thoroughly that even the memory of its existence had become a curiosity for scholars rather than a conviction for the faithful. The people had learned to live in the drift, and the drift had become the new normal. Generations were born and died without realizing that their feasts no longer fell where the Creator had fixed them. Passover rose and set according to civil decrees, not heavenly alignment. Sabbaths were counted from cycles already bent out of shape. Even the agricultural seasons, once harmonized with the appointed times, had been decoupled now, guided by market demand, shipping schedules, and global trade rather than the covenantal rhythm of the land. In this new reality, the shift was self-reinforcing. Those who taught the faith learned their dates from the altered calendar, and so they passed them on without question. Churches and synagogues printed festival schedules that matched the state's year. Printing presses, for all their power to spread knowledge, spread this particular error more efficiently than any conqueror's edict could have done. It is in this era that the Gregorian reform appeared, fine-tuning the already alien system to better suit astronomical calculation. Presented as a triumph of science, it was accepted without protest, but it did nothing to restore the Creator's 364-day cycle. Instead, it froze the deviation in place, ensuring that every future generation would inherit not just the altered dates, but the confidence that those dates were right. The most striking part of this drift is its silence. No wars were fought over the loss of the ancient calendar. No mass protests filled the streets. It was not torn from the people by violence. It was replaced by habit. And habit is a prison with walls so familiar that most never think to escape. Today, the drift is so complete that to suggest the modern calendar is wrong sounds absurd to most ears. Yet the distance between our days and the days of the divine design is measurable, traceable, undeniable for those willing to see it. And in that distance lies a question, one that may be more dangerous than the empires who first made the change, if we have built our worship, our traditions, and even our concept of time on a foundation that is not the Creator's. Then what else in our faith rests on borrowed ground long before the empires rose? The prophets spoke of a power that would think to change times and laws, Daniel 7:25. To many, these words have been read as metaphor, a symbol of rebellion against God's authority. But what if the prophecy was literal? What if the changing of times was not merely a shift in political eras, but an actual tampering with the structure of sacred time itself? When the calendar was altered, the echo of Daniel's warning rang across the centuries. The appointed times Moedim were not human traditions. They were the Creator's laws embedded in creation. To change them was to touch something untouchable, to reach into the order of heaven and pull it out of place. It was an act of defiance disguised as order, a rebellion dressed in the robes of reform. The prophetic writings hint at this connection. Daniel's vision of the fourth beast, terrifying and devouring, is not only about military conquest, but about a dominion that seeps into every aspect of life. Changing the calendar is a way of reorienting the worship of entire nations without dismantling their temples. It is the most efficient conquest. Alter the rhythm, and you alter the allegiance. Revelation picks up this theme with its imagery of beasts, false prophets, and counterfeit worship. The issue at the end of the age is not merely who we worship, but when we worship. In the divine economy, the when is part of the who. because it reveals whose timetable we honor. If the Creator's calendar is the original score, then the altered calendar is a different song entirely, no matter how similar the melody may sound. This is why the echo of prophecy matters now more than ever. If the alteration of sacred time was foretold, then its restoration must also be part of the final reckoning. To awaken to this reality is to recognize that prophecy is not abstract. It is unfolding in the structure of the year, in the dates we accept without question, in the ticking of a clock we did not set. The echo calls for more than awareness. It calls for decision. Will we continue to walk in the rhythm handed down by empires, or will we search out the rhythm given on Sinai, the one kept in the vault of heaven since the foundation of the world? Prophecy does not leave that question unanswered. It warns that the world will be divided by it, and those who hear the echo must decide which side of the line they will stand on. Once you realize that the rhythm of your life has been set by hands other than the Creator's, the question becomes unavoidable: can it be restored? The answer is not hidden in archives or locked in temples. It is inscribed in the heavens and preserved in the ancient record for those who will seek it. The call to return is not only a summons to knowledge, but to obedience. The Book of Jubilees was itself written as a preservation effort, a safeguard against the very drift we now live in. Its voice is urgent, pleading that the people keep the years according to the count of 364 days, so that the appointed times will not be forgotten. This is not nostalgia, it is covenant maintenance. In the biblical worldview, to keep the right time is to keep faith. To return is not as simple as tearing up one calendar and adopting another. It requires a reorientation of life. It means counting days and weeks as the Creator counts them, letting His appointments dictate the flow of work and rest, planting and harvest, worship and assembly. It is not a minor adjustment. It is a shift in loyalty from the systems of men back to the design of God. This is why the return is resisted. It is costly. It challenges the authority of civil and religious structures that have long since built themselves around the altered rhythm. To realign with the 364-day year is to reject the convenience of the familiar for the discipline of the true. It will make you a stranger in your own time, living in harmony with a clock most of the world no longer hears. Yet the invitation stands, as it always has. Stand by the roads, and look, and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls. Jeremiah 6:16. The ancient path of time is not lost. It is simply overgrown. Those who clear it will not only find their steps aligned with the Creator's, they will rediscover the joy of meeting Him in the exact moments He set from the beginning. To return is to remember, and to remember is to live again in the breath of sacred time, where each day is not just a date on a page, but a note in the Creator's eternal song. There was a time, long after the empire's calendar had conquered the public square, when small and scattered communities still kept the ancient count. They were not powerful, and they did not rule kingdoms. They were farmers, scribes, hermits, and scholars, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in conviction. While the world turned to the rhythm of Rome and its successors, these few clung to the 364-day cycle as though it were a lifeline to heaven itself. They did not keep it out of stubborn tradition. They kept it because they believed it was the appointed framework that bound heaven and earth together. Each feast they observed, each Sabbath they marked, was a quiet act of resistance against the noise of the altered year. They saw themselves not as rebels, but as caretakers, guardians of a trust given on Sinai, carried through the wilderness and sealed in the covenant. But over the centuries, their voices grew faint. Persecution silenced some. Assimilation claimed others. Scrolls were lost in fires, or buried in forgotten caves, or locked in libraries where no one read them. Even within their own families, the knowledge sometimes died with the elder who carried it. A single missed generation could erase centuries of careful keeping. In some cases, these guardians vanished without leaving a trace. The reasons are lost to history: wars, plagues, migrations, but their disappearance was like the extinguishing of a lamp in a darkened hall. Without them, the living memory of the Creator's calendar dimmed even further, and the altered year tightened its grip on the world. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere, hidden in a remote valley or preserved by a faithful remnant, the true count was kept without interruption. Perhaps it was. But in the records we have, the story of the last guardians ends not with a triumphant restoration, but with silence. Their absence is a warning truth. Even divine truth must be actively kept, or it will be swallowed by the noise of the age. The silence they left behind is not empty. It is heavy, like the pause before a storm, like a page left blank in a sacred book. And for those who hear it, it is not only a grief for what was lost, it is a challenge. If the last guardians have fallen silent, then who will take up their watch through every fragment of history, every prophetic whisper, every buried warning? One truth has pressed its way to the surface. The changing of the calendar was never just about marking days. It was about shifting the axis of covenant itself. The 364-day year was not a cultural artifact. It was the Creator's appointed framework for the meeting of heaven and earth. To alter it was to alter the relationship between God and His people at the most fundamental level. In the ancient design, every day was a note in a symphony composed before the foundations of the world. The Sabbaths were the steady rhythm, the feasts, the crescendos, the jubilees, the grand cycles that brought the whole composition to fullness. The calendar was the score, and humanity was called to play in perfect time with the composer. But the score was rewritten. The music still plays, but it is out of key, out of time, beautiful in fragments, but disconnected from its original harmony. The change was slow, deliberate, and nearly invisible, until the altered rhythm felt natural and the original seemed foreign. And in that shift, the appointments of the king were missed, replaced by appointments made by men. The revelation is not simply that this happened, but that it was foretold and that it will matter again. Prophecy speaks of a time when the whole world will be called to choose between two authorities. The choice will not only be about belief, but about alignment, whose time we keep, whose rhythm we follow, whose calendar governs our worship. This is the truth most will not want to face. Living in the wrong time is not a minor error. It is a declaration of allegiance. The one who sets your days sets your life. And if those days were set by an empire, a council, or a church rather than by the one who spoke creation into being, then your worship is already bent toward another throne. The final revelation is not an accusation, it is an invitation. The ancient path of time is still there, waiting for those willing to seek it. The same God who gave the count to Moses has not withdrawn it. The score can still be played as it was written, but it will require the courage to unlearn the rhythm of the age and to let your days be reset by the hand of the composer himself. You have walked through the fragments of a story buried under millennia of habit, conquest, and quiet forgetting. You have seen the blueprint of time as it was given on Sinai, the deliberate hands that reshaped it, the silent drift that carried us into an age where almost no one remembers the original count. And now, you stand at the threshold where knowledge becomes responsibility. The call to awaken is not a call to curiosity alone, it is a summons to alignment. The Creator's calendar is not a relic for scholars or an obscure detail for historians. It is the living framework of covenant. To ignore it is to live by a borrowed heartbeat. To return to it is to feel your steps sink once more with the rhythm of heaven. The choice will not be made in a moment of convenience. It will come as it came to the prophets, to the guardians, to the few who heard the echo before you in the tension between the comfort of the familiar and the cost of the true. To awaken is to choose the latter. It is to step outside the clock tower of empire and listen again for the pulse of the ancient song. Do not expect the world to applaud. It will not understand why you reorder your days, why you measure your life by a number it abandoned long ago. But the one who set the lights in the sky will see, and he will know that you have chosen his time over all others. So here is the question that will follow you after these words fade when the appointed day comes, and it will come. Will you be standing in the right moment, in the right place, at the right time? The calendar of men will not answer for you. Only the calendar of the King will, and that is why the call is urgent, and why it comes to you now. Awaken, and return to the time he made.